they really stick with you.
Hi everybody, my name's Lily. I would plus one what everybody has said, but I think pulling from, yeah, and um, a tradition of resistance, like in our own backyard, a little bit, and like pulling from those histories really intentionally feels very meaningful to me. I've also been thinking a lot about the Constitution and the role of the Constitution and transforming like our society into one where workers are in control and what that looks like as we're like envisioning the future and fighting that document and fighting those institutions more intentionally than I think the left typically does in my experience. And there's like a lack of seriousness of addressing and attacking that as a framework. So this is really grounded in me that like importance of learning from the past to frame how we move forward strategically. So yeah,
Cool.
one of many takeaways for me.
Cool. Thank you all so much. I know a couple of people ran in, but we're running kind of late on the stream, so we can definitely stick around for a few minutes and kind of chop it up afterward. Thanks to everyone on the stream for waiting a couple minutes. We were just, reflecting a little bit on what folks are going to be taking away from the book, which I hope will be a lot. And it's, for me, it's very hard to believe that this is our last session of our 12 weeks on Black Reconstruction, and that we're, in a sense, almost finished with Black Reconstruction. But the good news is that you're never finished with Black Reconstruction, because Black Reconstruction isn't finished with you. And at the very least, until racial capitalism is dismantled and white supremacy is dismantled, and the sort of global imperialism that they unleash have been wiped from the face of the earth, this is going to be a book that remains incredibly relevant, albeit in a kind of tragic way, right? And that's true of all incredibly important books, right? The relevance of some of those important books that we read is only sort of a tragic relevance, and the authors, I'm sure, wish that they had they would have lost their relevance by this point. Now coming up to 90 years on from the publication of Black Reconstruction. Speaking though of its ongoing relevance, I'm super excited. It's actually hard to explain how excited I am to see the fact that finally this month specifically, we're seeing the publication of the very first Spanish translation of Black Reconstruction. That's been in the works for a while now. It's been, a sort of palpable absence for much, much longer. Actually, we're putting together an edited book on Black Reconstruction. And part of what I was writing about was the reception of Du Bois's work in Latin America. And one of the main barriers to that reception, of course, is the fact that no one gets to read this book, right? And of course, it's an incredibly massive book, difficult to translate. The length of the book that Du Bois published in the middle of the Great Depression was already a problem for publishing it in its English edition, and getting that translated was an incredibly heavy lift. So we're so glad that this month people will be able to read it finally. It's being published by a great radical press in Argentina called Tinta Limón. We're excited to have that available to Spanish-speaking revolutionaries worldwide. And in part, I want to be super clear about this, part of the reason it's difficult to get a book like that translated is that it's seen as being about a specific context, right? So it's like, oh, if you're doing American studies or studying the US, it might be interesting to you as a Spanish speaker. But the reality is, and this is, I think, increasingly obvious to people across Latin America, that the framework is much, much broader, both what it offers as a historical analysis and the framework, the racial capitalist framework for moving forward. So, we're very glad that that's available. We want to begin, as usual, recapping a little bit about what we talked about last week in the chapter on the counter-revolution of property. And we talked about this. This is a chapter in which Du Bois really plays out this dynamic and contradictory process that leads to the possibility of Reconstruction and then its downfall. And, I mentioned last week, I used the phrase two-step, and so I'm just sticking with that phrase because it's a very interesting one, right? In which Northern capitalists use Black votes to break the power of the planter in the South. And then in the process of that, they unleash capitalist predation across the entire South, right? It's a rush, it's a frenzy for intervening, for theft, robbery, and all the kinds of characters and unsavory sort of activities that brings to the South. And then those same capitalists blame Black people primarily for that predation, right? They blame them for the capitalism that they have themselves have unleashed. And Du Bois is very, very clear throughout the book that the corruption of Reconstruction was capitalist, right? And it was no more carried out by, sort of black political leaders than by anyone else under this capitalist system. And we saw in the course of that chapter, of course, that despite the fact that Du Bois calls it a counter-revolution, we need to understand that in a dialectical sense, meaning that it's not a counter to the revolution which turns backwards, but instead it was this complex fusion of what he had described earlier in the book as two perspectives, one of which looks backward, namely the planter class, that looks backward toward a replacement for an anachronistic system in slavery, and also this new modern capitalist class that ultimately wins out, right? So you've got this reunification of capital, but it needs to be understood as a dialectically charged and complex reunification. And of course, it is the new modernizing vision of capital that wins out and that instantiates what Du Bois describes in many different terms. Right? He describes it as a sort of feudalism. He describes it as a sort of new mega dictatorship, and he describes it as a new and vast monarchy, right? He's playing here, of course, with the different categories that we would often associate with different modes of production, but which for him come together in his analysis of this frame. He speaks of and uses a specific phrase in his final kind of critique of some of the politically centered abolitionists when he says that people like Sumner failed to recognize that revolutions revolutions are economic and they require force. Right? These are fundamental observations. Again, this is a bit of a recap for him, for us, but the way that he unravels it in that chapter on the counter-revolution in particular is to show, again, something we already know, that political rights are not enough, by which he means very specifically, black people had the right to vote, and yet then they couldn't vote suddenly, right? Despite still having that right on paper, they did not have it in material reality because of white terrorism that was brought to bear against their sort of vote. But he also means that the Panic of 1873, the economic panic that began right toward the end of Reconstruction, was really the beginning of the end because it had a sort of powerful degree of autonomy over the political dynamic that had been playing out, right? And we saw the way that this cut right down to the sort of ontological process and progress that had been established during Reconstruction, namely the fact that many white people had begun to see black people as more human, right? In the context of economic panic and crisis, that priority goes out the window, that belief, that faith goes out the window, and there's a retreat of that level of established equality and of, and a sort of reemergence of their sort of white supremacist foundations. And finally, of course, we saw the very important, overlooked, but incredibly essential argument that Du Bois makes about the anchoring of a new global imperialism in this process in the US South, in the defeat of Reconstruction. Right? We saw from the very beginning that his framing out of the racial capitalist thesis in this moment was to say, enslaved black people in the US South were the cornerstone of global capitalism at the outset of the war. And the way that this comes full circle is the way in which the tacit agreement that white supremacy was acceptable at home in the US South underwrote what would become an expanding US capitalism in a context of global imperialist capitalist competition, right? So you have not a couple of decades passing before the US becomes a profoundly imperialist force. And for Du Bois, that can be seen and understood as operating on many levels, but all the way right down to the local level in the historic and continuing disenfranchisement that the South's political power rests on, right? The South for Du Bois is a reactionary place, not because of some essential nature that people have in the US South, but because it's always and still today operates on the basis of disenfranchising poor people, white and black, right? As long as it does that, as long as it holds that power, it is reactionary, it is conservative. That conservatism has a sort of, holds a leverage over the entirety of the US government, and that leverage underwrites global imperialism as well, right? So we saw a great deal in this chapter, and then we asked the question as we finished our conversation about the counter-revolution of property as to why that wasn't the end of the book. It kind of feels like the end of the book. And yet there's this chapter about public education and the public school. And one of the questions that we want to think about it, and I asked folks to think hard about the positioning of this chapter on the public school, which seems sort of anomalous, right? The book seems kind of over. Why is it happening? Why is it located at this part of the argument? Why is it seemingly tacked onto the end? And on the one hand, there are some things we could say. First and foremost, it's about the educational legacies of Reconstruction. So it needs to be toward the end of the book, on the one hand. But this simply raises another question. Why is Du Bois writing an entire chapter on education? He hasn't dedicated an entire chapter to any specific question in that same way in the book. And I think we can find the answer both in Du Bois' own long-standing commitments around education and in the particularities of Reconstruction that he wants to underline. On the one hand, here is someone who always centered education as a path toward liberation. But it's worth understanding that this shifts over time, and in different kind of historical terrain. The ability to liberate oneself through education was overstated by the young Du Bois. If we look at something like The Souls of Black Folk, or even earlier, and if we think about the sort of famous, and controversial term of, Du Bois's emphasis on what was called the talented 10th. In other words, the 10% of educated Black Americans would be the ones who would play a key role and also have a special obligation to raising up the rest, right? So education, of course, played a key role in that. But by the time we get to Black Reconstruction, several decades later, we've seen the ways that education is part of a broader package that he describes very often as land, leading, and light. Land is material economic redistribution. Leading is political rights, political power, and leadership. And light is education, knowledge, right? And consciousness, right? It's much bigger than simply education for Du Bois. We should understand that for sure. So land, leading, and light, education is part of this package by the time we get to this, this book. And second, this shifting orientation, in other words, Du Bois' own reassessment of the weight and autonomy that education can have when it comes to liberation struggles, isn't entirely separable from his own incorporation of what he sees as the lessons of Reconstruction, right? For a couple of decades, he had been studying, thinking more about, writing about Reconstruction. And one of the lessons, of course, is that education is important, but it's not everything, right? And that education was a durable, if not the most durable legacy of the Reconstruction period for him, as we will see. And we also see the ways in which Du Bois comes to see education itself as a far more material and collective process. What he describes at the beginning of this chapter as the rhythm, a discovery of the rhythm of united effort, right? That's very different from an individualist understanding of sort of advancing oneself through learning. So we turn to the chapter, and from the very beginning, Du Bois is asking us, what can we expect from this very interesting language that we want to parse a little bit? This is in the second paragraph. What is it that we can expect from a poor, degraded, and disadvantaged horde that has only been free for 10 years? Again, it's important to understand that despite the pejorative language that Du Bois is using, I mean, horde is clearly a pejorative word, although we'll think hard about what it is that he means by using it. His point is the same point that he's been emphasizing from the beginning, namely that these are ordinary people, right? He has already said poor, working Black people who were freed and brought into democracy are the same as poor working white people who have been brought into democracy some decades earlier. So he's trying to show the ordinariness, so that they're no different from other working people, other disadvantaged people. And so the real question is, what can be expected? And as he puts it very clearly, something but not everything, right? To develop some but surely not all social leadership. So he's saying, what is the bar that we use to measure the success of Reconstruction in terms of a process and in terms of education? And the answer, something, not nothing. And then he goes on to say, with proper support, at least the absence maybe of overt aggression, he argues that just on a baseline level, Black literacy would have been somewhere on the level of a country like Denmark, as he puts it. And even without that support, as he describes it, it's on the level of Spain. So he's saying, he's trying to sort of, set the bar at a realistic level to be materialist and be sort of, consistent about it. And it reminds me, in some ways, it makes me think of when we think of things like, well, how do you measure the success of the Cuban Revolution, right? You don't measure it in terms of capitalist output, of course. You don't measure it in terms of, and you couldn't measure it in terms of GDP, right? And you have to measure it, and you have to set that bar, as Du Bois is showing us, according to something like, what in the context of a debilitating embargo could we expect from a country with a very low GDP? And when you look at something like the UN, development, indices, what you see is that Cuba, because of that, adjusted for GDP, does very, very well, right? And ranks above, many sort of middle range countries. So you've got Du Bois trying to set a bar for how we interpret progress, right? And then he says something interesting. He says, this something, again, the accomplishment in the bar is that they accomplished something, not everything. And yet this something is what he describes as the crowning achievement of Reconstruction, right? We're beginning to see why this chapter matters so much to Du Bois, for it to be the crowning achievement of the Reconstruction process. Now he adds something different, interesting, even troubling and contradictory that we're going to come back to toward the end of the chapter, when he says and describes this crowning achievement as the gift of New England to the Black South. I'm gonna just very transparently say that phrase weirds me out, but we want to get into it and we want to understand it. It was a gift from the outside, and if it was a gift from the outside, whose accomplishment was it? These are some of the questions that we want to raise. And again, the question may be a little confusing at the beginning of the chapter, but I think by the time we get toward the end, it'll make more sense. He begins by insisting very clearly that Black Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War and during Reconstruction, or even long prior, wanted to learn. Black Americans wanted to learn. And this fact for Du Bois already sets them apart from many other, what he would understand to be kind of degraded and disadvantaged masses, whose material conditions, as he puts it, this is toward the bottom of the very first page still, their material conditions of dispossession create a sort of willful kind of ignorance, right? A celebration of traditional wisdom, a rejection of book learning in quotes. And Du Bois definitely sees this as a sort of tacit acceptance of the inferiority that the system is generating, right? In other words, if you're prevented from or unable to engage in systematic traditional education, there's this reaction to say, well, I don't want that anyway. It's not practical. It doesn't help me do the things that I want to do. And there's some very important context here for Du Bois, which is that he had a long-standing disagreement, some would call it a bitter feud, with Booker T. Washington, one of the most important spokespeople of Black Americans in this period, and it's centered on the question of education. Essentially, and we've mentioned this, I think, before, Booker T. Washington's strategy was one of economic uplift, right? And that economic uplift was bought at the price of saying, you know what, listen, we're going to develop vocational schools and we're going to build economic power, but we're not going to ask to vote and we're not going to ask for higher education, right? Traditional forms of higher education. So there's a turning away from higher education and turning toward practical vocational learning. Du Bois, of course, for people that know him, for people that have even maybe seen a picture of him, know that this is a very classical education kind of person, right? He's someone who celebrates classics, celebrates the humanities, and sees them as crucial for general education, crucial for opening up different horizons of different ways to think that are not contained within a kind of vocational frame, right? Asking big questions, even if these don't seem like practical questions. This is one of the maybe understated resonances with the present, right? We live in a moment in which the humanities have been attacked for decades now for their non-profitability and their lack of kind of like practical sort of relevance. So here is a reframing of the conflict with Booker T. Washington and the insistence that, Black people wanted to learn will become important. Now, of course, during slavery, Black people were prohibited from education. And we take that as sort of a fact, something that seems very obvious and self-evident, but it reveals a deep contradiction about the way that the slave system understood itself. This is a contradiction that many people have sort of disentangled, but I think one of the best, sort of indictments of it comes in Frederick Douglass's What to a Slave is the 4th of July speech. It's a great speech on many accounts. But in that speech, Douglass says, this very interesting thing. He says that laws against educating enslaved people conceded their personhood or their manhood, as he calls it, right? He says, in these laws, he says, Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding the teaching of the slave to read and write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. In other words, on the one hand, slave systems insisted on the dehumanization and the inhumanity of enslaved people. In other words, their incapacity to learn. Why teach them? They're incapable of learning, right? They're incapable of higher level thought. And Douglass is saying, why then prohibit it? Why then pass laws with strict, violent penalties for educating them? This and all other laws which held enslaved people to be responsible, again, I've mentioned laws and the sort of trials around slave insurrection, they contain and they reveal this contradiction, which is to say, you know these are people because you're trying to hold them responsible. You know these are people because you know that they can learn. You don't prohibit and punish education when you know, if you actually believe that it were impossible. And as Douglass puts it, in such laws, the manhood of the slave is conceded. This eagerness for education, which Du Bois states is just a fundamental fact, and this eagerness for education among free Black people was so strong that it became a central plank of Reconstruction. We've already seen the ways that, particularly in South Carolina, education was a huge part of the legislation, the establishment of this public school system that Du Bois is talking about in this chapter. And on the whole, despite the reversals and the defeat of Reconstruction, Du Bois is arguing in this chapter that education was one of the few things to survive. It didn't survive unscathed, but it's one of the few things that did, in fact, survive. On top of this, he's arguing that just like Reconstruction as a whole, which refused racial categories in the new constitutions, and which pursued, as a result, a program of universal advancement and development, the same applies as well to education. If you look at page 638, he states it very clearly, two-thirds of the way down. He says, public education for all at public expense was in the South a Negro idea. In other words, Black people made public education happen in the South for everyone, right? It was never an important policy. It was written into some of the Southern constitutions a century prior, but it was never, Du Bois argues, put into practice. Southern states paid lip service, he says, to public education, but they never actually accomplished it. Even if they had, of course, we would wonder whether that could be understood as truly public if it were, of course, racially bifurcated in such a clear way. The reason, as he argues, that it wasn't ever put into practice is because property owners, on the one hand, didn't want to pay for it through taxation, but more fundamentally, they saw it as disruptive to their potential labor force, right? This is a heavily agricultural, labor force, and they did not want to educate those workers. And as Du Bois adds, white workers and white laborers didn't demand it. They didn't demand education because they didn't see it as relevant to what it was that they were doing. It was only, this is on page 641, that other part of the laboring class, the Black folk, who connected knowledge with power, right? So this was a specific insight Du Bois is associating with Black Americans that says, we see the connection between knowledge and power. We are going to put that into practice and establish a public education system that then will have rebounding effects on the political system. And it's with probably more than a bit of sort of relish that Du Bois then at the bottom of 641 quotes Booker T. Washington himself toward this end when he says, this is a quote from Booker T. Washington, "It was a whole race trying to go to school." Everyone wanted to study, everyone wanted to learn. Of course, what Washington eventually wants that learning to look like is very limited compared to what Du Bois is trying to establish. And recall that education for Du Bois in particular, but for the entire abolitionist framework, is a crucial part of the period and the process of transition that, again, we've kind of coded as dictatorship for Du Bois. Again, dictatorship means transition, and that transition means transforming the economy, but it also means transforming consciousness through education. Some of the questions early abolitionists had about the black vote in particular was whether or not that should come first or the education should come prior to the vote, right? So education is truly central to this sort of abolitionist frame. And the schools that were established under radical Reconstruction governments were effective, they were universal, they were ambitious, they were progressive, and they were, of course, then widely criminalized when the process was dismantled. But here I want to return to the question that I kind of posed at the beginning. If you flip over to page 667, one of the few passages, there are already a few for those who've been sort of around, there are a few passages that really confuse me and that actually stand to me as still very much open questions. And this is one of them, where you're trying to read Du Bois's tone, you're trying to use the context and the things you know about him to try to figure out where the sarcasm is, where the reality is. And this is kind of one of those passages. And it's got to do with that question of the New England legacy. So he's talking on the top of 667 about the influence from the North. We've talked about carpetbaggers and how broad that category is. Here he's talking about those who are smeared as carpetbaggers, who are also bringing education south, right? Who are bringing the system of what he calls the New England College and trying to implant that into the South and to give the Southern black man a leadership based on scholarship and character. He says this was the salvation of the South and the Negro. These carpetbaggers deserve to be remembered and honored. Without them, this is where it gets weird. Without them, there can be no doubt that the Negro would have rushed into revolt and vengeance and played into the hands of those determined to crush him. Right? That's already getting interesting. And then further down into the next paragraph, he says, had it not been for the Negro school and college, the Negro would, to all intents and purposes, have been driven back to slavery. But further down, still on toward the very bottom, he says, they avoided the mistake of trying to meet force by force. They bent to the storm of beating, lynching, and murder, and kept their souls in spite of public and private insults of every description. They built an inner culture which the world recognizes in spite of the fact that it is still half-strangled and inarticulate. So on the one hand, he's talking about this sort of nucleus of education that's established under Reconstruction, and then despite the dismantling of schools, is held, right, is continued. It's a sort of secret cargo that's being carried through Jim Crow and carried through different forms of segregation and discrimination. But it raises some really important and interesting questions, right? These are the ones I've come up with, but if y'all have more, in a minute, I would love to also hear them. First, was this education system truly the accomplishment of formerly enslaved Black Southerners, or was it imported from the North, right? Was it imported by these so-called carpetbaggers, what he calls the Northern schoolmarm? And so whose accomplishment was it, right? Second, what to make of this unsettling suggestion that uneducated Black people would necessarily rush to vengeance, right? Because he seems to suggest this. Without the schools, they would have rushed to vengeance. Third, isn't his whole argument throughout the book that on some level, Reconstruction needed to meet force with force? And fourth, finally, why does it seem as if passivity, bending to the storm, as he puts it, or dare we say turning the other cheek, is connected to keeping one's soul intact, right? Remaining the sort of good person that you aspire to be, right? It seems like there's this opposition between violent vengeance on the one hand and keeping your soul intact that Du Bois is framing. Now, this seems both questionable on a historical level, right? Again, I always bring up Black Jacobins, and James says very clearly, he says, transhistorically speaking, the violence of revolt and resistance against systems of oppression is always less than the violence of those systems, right? So it seems strange to sort of suggest that that violence would be so powerful that it would either destroy the process or destroy the individual, right? And it also seems to reflect, I think, a concern that we've raised about Du Bois before, an open question about how he positions himself with respect to the Black masses, right? Poor working class people, right? Not himself, right? Who he is shown throughout the book as embodying and deploying a rationality or sort of a way of thinking, a form of knowledge that is more spontaneous, even kind of euphoric and ecstatic, as opposed to sort of a cold rationality. And you could say that this argument is sort of compatible with what he's been saying about the ordinariness of the Black Americans who made Reconstruction, right? Which implies that that ordinariness also means being impacted by material conditions of ignorance, of lack of education, of distance, geographic distance from one another, as we've talked about previously. But at the same time, I think it invites us to take a slightly critical distance to wonder about the way that Du Bois binds these different pieces together. And the potentially worrying implication that he's suggesting that Northern educations in a way saved Southern Black people from themselves, right, in this chapter. Those are some questions that I want to raise about the education piece, and I'll just end with one more, and then I'll take some questions from you all in the room and questions from the stream. And that's the piece where he says, had it not been for this education system, Black people in the South would have been driven back towards slavery, right? And of course, I asked the question because we've turned the page to the next chapter, and the next chapter is called Back Towards Slavery, right? So is there a contradiction here? Is there a sort of like a needle that he's trying to thread around what it was that happened, the degree to which it was a reversion towards slavery, and this space he's trying to carve out for the importance of the educational process as the important legacy, right? As the surviving legacy of, the most important surviving legacy of Reconstruction. So let's take some questions on the education chapter before we move toward the final chapter and some broad kind of wrap up pieces. What do folks have?
This is not really a question, but this made me think about like the publishers for this like study. Was there any because it was like in the 30s, right? So wouldn't the publisher also like have some I feel like Du Bois wouldn't outright say everything he wanted to say.
Yeah.
So like for him to like say it through between the lines, you know what I mean? Because this was the first study that was like out for Black people. So like to be outright and be like, oh, this is the fault of like the Northern capitalists or like, you know what I mean? I don't know if you could say more about the publishing and publisher in general.
As I mentioned earlier, because we were talking about the new Spanish edition, like first and foremost, the book was way too long, right? The publisher said, it is the Depression. Paper costs a lot of money and people don't have money to buy books. So why did you hand in a book that's 3 times as long as it was supposed to be? And as we've also mentioned, the second major piece is that they changed the title, right? They rejected his original title, which was The Black Reconstruction of Democracy in America. So that's a good example, right? Where he's still saying that, right? He says it very clearly in the book, but they changed the title, right? But at the same time, I do think that Du Bois does not really pull any punches throughout the text, right? He is very straightforward, and to the point where the sort of mealy-mouthed liberal historians that then review the book in the 30s and 40s, they call it a polemic, they call it angry, they say all of these things that like you, of course, would fundamentally expect racist historians to say, but they're doing so to try to kind of denigrate it because it says what it's saying too clearly. So I don't exactly think that that's the case here. I think he grew up in Connecticut. And he, in Massachusetts, in Great Barrington, in Massachusetts, he went to prep school, right? he studied in a liberal arts context, right? He knows it firsthand, like very, very up close. And while you know from his work, particularly from Souls, that he has a very complex relationship to that context, right? He talks about that's the context at school where he realized racism was a thing, right? Where it first hit him, right? But he still values it, I think. And when he goes south to teach, part of what he himself is trying to do is to bring that down there as well, right? So I think there's an honesty here. And so I'm still kind of struggling with how he positions himself. Yeah.
Okay, so we have somebody from the chat who says, what to Du Bois is education? Is it traditional Western education? What does it consist of for him?
That's a great question. I mean, that honestly gets to the heart of a lot of this. And we haven't, like, we've talked a little bit about form. I think we've talked less about content, right? I mean, we've hinted at content when I talk about classical kind of humanities, very, very sort of traditional education in that kind of sense. But I would say Du Bois is definitely someone who has a deep respect for that structure of higher education, right? One of the questions is going to be how that, how that shifts over time in terms of how he thinks that structure should be, institutionalized, what those institutions should look like. He doesn't go so far as, of course, questioning the entire structure of saying that the European tradition of thought or European philosophy or the humanities are irrelevant, or the classics. We're going to talk in a minute about how much he talks about fucking Greek myth, right? And how much Greek myth means to him, right? And he shares this with his entire generation, actually the generation even that comes a little later, right? People like Aimé Césaire, very much trained in these traditional schools, right? For Césaire and others, Fanon, these are colonial schools. And so that's part of the education. And one of the questions is always how to resist and transform that, how to maintain its relevance, maintain the relevance of the pieces that you think are important or useful. So again, this is a good way of asking the question of how he relates to that sort of, very high level traditional learning. And I think the answer is that he appreciates a great deal of it. He finds it beneficial. He finds it important to think about questions that are not connected directly to reality, right? Or that serve as these sort of very abstract ways of thinking about it, right? So we will talk about that in a second. Does anyone have one more question? Oh yeah, I've got two.
I'm glad you pointed this out because it felt like such a contradiction when I was reading it as well. And because if we're thinking of like Northeast education at the time, it would still be under the American assumption. And we talked just the chapter before around the pacification of the Black vote through some of this co-opting. And it made me think about like allyship or like nice white people. And in terms of impact, it seemed that the ability for schools to continue educating Black teachers was under the intolerance of the white masses who did not want white teachers to be teaching in Black classrooms. And perhaps it's that intolerance and racism fueled by white exceptionalism that allowed the carpetbaggers, or however we classify them, to actually be helpful much more than the education itself.
That's a great question, and I think you're exactly right about the kinds of stakes that it raises, and the kind of strategic decisions Du Bois is confronted with, right? So yes, a lot of these schools, we live in Philadelphia, or most of us live in Philadelphia. This is a very Quaker town, right? We know, and we talked about this a little bit last time, or it's come up before, the ways in which that's a very mixed bag, right? Very good education, very sort of collective understanding of what it means to engage in community building, and also the owning of slaves, right? And also a rupture around the question of abolition, there are Quaker schools all over the place, right? And we know perfectly well today that these are very safe, liberal spaces that are not particularly radical, that are not particularly anti-racist, right? So we know, I think, what the stakes are of this question, and at the same time, they're sharper for Du Bois, right? And so when he's confronting a context in which It's sort of either this or a very, very different kind of education or no education at all, right? I think that definitely impacts his strategic understanding of, like, would you invite the Quakers down to the U.S. South to engage? Yeah, absolutely. Of course you would. That doesn't mean they're perfect, right? But it does mean that, in the context that he's struggling with, or in the context of the civil rights, movement, would it be a question of denying, like progressives from being a part of that process of holding freedom schools, and which of course happened in the 50s and 60s? No, yeah. So it's the same kind of question, and I think that's a crucial point. Do we have one more question in the back? Yeah.
Earlier, when you finished the chapter, you mentioned was Du Bois being, I can't remember the word you used, was it hypocritical, or was he about education saving black people from returning back into slavery? Is that what you said? I would have to say he wasn't being hypocritical in saying that, because this book was written when, like 1930s?
Yeah, 35, yeah.
35. So that was still when he was having a disagreement with Booker T. Washington on whether or not black people receiving an education and understand politics, or whether or not they should just work. They didn't so much had a feud, it was more so of a philosophical difference. So I would have to say, in the context of what he was talking about, yes, but that was only because he mentions it in the chapter. They had close proximity to what wealth looked like and saw that having it did not make these people educated. They were barely able to even live on their own, which is why they fought back so hard. It comes up in the following chapter, back to slavery. Not having the education and having the money wouldn't have helped. How that goes about helping or hindering, you could read The Black Bourgeoisie to see how that gets laid out. But yeah, I disagreed with you when you said, oh, maybe that was hypocritical or contradictory, because again, we get future context on what happens, but if you take it in context of when this is happening, yeah, having the money would not have helped.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And it also is like, it complements this other question in the sense of like, what are the other strategic decisions that Du Bois is trying to make, right? What is the strategic context is that when he's writing this chapter, like, he is arguing against Booker T. Washington, right? And he's trying to bend the stick in that direction to say, you know what? It's really important that these schools came down. It's really important that this education program came down. And I do also appreciate the point about wealth without education, right? Or just like wealth in general, right? I mean, wealth in general is not enough to stop Black Wall Street in Tulsa from being bombed, right? Wealth alone doesn't. And again, that's why Du Bois is saying wealth, economic wealth, and education, and political power, right? And how do we get all those? So I think that's a really great point, and I, appreciate it. And I still, I still worry about, I guess I worry a little bit about him suggesting that without that, it would have been, it would have been a problem if Black people in the South fought back without, any kind of like measured control over themselves. That's sort of what the passage implies. And so that's the only discomfort, but I agree with you 100% in terms of that crucial context, for sure. And of course, he's talking about a context in which the most brutal repression is already happening, right? So we don't want to downplay that as a threat, or, a threat for him to take seriously. And that's, of course, what happens in this chapter, right? And it already happened in Counterrevolution and Back Towards Slavery. He really lays out in new and different ways the way he understands that sort of reversal of dialectical progress, right? The sort of violent beating backward and bending backward of what many Marxists or Hegelians might understand to be the sort of inevitable forward march of history that does not, describe the actual historical experience of racialized, enslaved, and colonized people for Du Bois. And this is another great example with incredibly important dialectical implications. And we should note that in the summary, he begins by talking about, as he puts it, how the Civil War in the South began again indeed had never ceased, right? I don't know how this actually records on screen.
I think we're good.
Is it running?
It's
Oh, wait.
recording right now.
Yeah. Recording, everything. So we should be live. Like, they should be able to hear us.
Yeah,
Yeah. Cool. Seems like it's up. Sorry, folks. We had a bit of a issue with the stream. We've been like super like. I was about to say that we haven't had tech problems in a while. That's not exactly true, but we've had fewer tech problems for a while. But let me see if I can get. Yeah. I'm trying to record. Do you know where my voice memos are?
Oh.
How do I find those?
Oh, Mecca.
No, I definitely haven't. All right. I mean, maybe I shouldn't try it. I don't know.
If anything, I could just do YouTube to MP3 or something like that. Take
Okay.
The stream and put it on.
Okay. Cool. Thanks. You didn't? Okay. Oh, yeah? Cool. Awesome. Thank you all so much for your patience. Sorry about the glitch. We'll try to bring it back together if we can. So we're turning to the last chapter finally. Why are you smiling so much? I know, right? I thought you were smiling because porque anda allá hablando. So we're talking about the Greek myth, right? And the very different Greek myths that Du Bois, first of all, the fact that Du Bois loves Greek myth, the fact that he always refers to it, has a strong bearing on his understanding of what education could and should look like. And we're talking about the list of mythical figures that Du Bois had already used to sort of describe Black Americans, starting with Nemesis, right? Nemesis, who is dropped in the middle of white America and punishes colonial racial hubris. This is one of the first descriptions that Du Bois offers, right? Black people as Nemesis. Then he speaks of Sisyphus, and people know, presumably, the myth of Sisyphus, who was also guilty of hubris. Again, hubris is like this sort of exaggerated arrogance, specifically, in relation to offending the gods themselves, right? So Sisyphus offends the gods by evading death, I believe, and he's sentenced to perpetually roll a stone up a hill, which then rolls back down, right? We're getting a sort of like, the permanence of this sort of condition through this figure. And finally here, he's speaking of Prometheus, which has a very similar significance for Greek myth and for Du Bois, also guilty of hubris against the gods, and condemned very famously to have his liver pecked out by an eagle every day, and then overnight his liver regenerates and it's pecked out by the eagle again the next day, right? We're talking about eternal condemnation, eternal suffering, eternal punishment, right? So each of these figures in a certain sense reflects the idea of eternal punishment, although Prometheus is particular in the sense that it's got much more to it, I think. And Prometheus, I think, it makes Prometheus, I think, the best sort of, mythical figure for Du Bois to rely on in general. And certainly following the previous chapter, because what Prometheus did was to steal fire from the gods, right? And stealing fire from the gods is a question of both enlightenment and of power, right? Fire is very famously the light when Du Bois speaks of land, light, and leading. And it's also anchored in and anchors the power to determine one's own history, the power to control destiny. This is what it means to steal fire from the gods. And this is the punishment that Prometheus was condemned to. So despite the eternal suffering, right, what reads initially as a figure of eternal suffering is also something much more. And I think we could and should read it as Du Bois breaking with what could be or would otherwise be a very pessimistic understanding of history and a pessimistic understanding of the, of the position of Black Americans in that history. We've said a lot about pessimism, Afro-pessimism. I think it's relevant to this reading in particular. In Back Towards Slavery, Du Bois documents the materiality of how this violent rollback of Reconstruction takes place. He talks about how the disorder of war gives way to what he describes as a labor war, and then an intra-labor war, and then a race war. This is right on the first page. He says, then it became a labor war, an attempt on the part of impoverished capitalists and landholders to force laborers to work. From this, it changed to a war between laborers, white and Black, fighting for a job. And afterward, the white laborer joined the white landholder and capitalist and beat the Black laborer into subjection, right? A war of race hatred. And again, recall that the planter and the white worker had very different, or the white Southern, poor person, had very different objectives, right? The planter at the end of the war was looking backwards and simply wanted Black labor and wanted a system grounded on Black labor, a caste system. The white Southerner wanted a system that would displace Black labor with poor white labor as a stepping stone toward the accumulation of wealth. So they had these contradictory frameworks from the very beginning. And Du Bois emphasizes very clearly the fact that land redistribution, which of course was not accomplished in any significant way under Reconstruction, would have not only changed the material conditions of freed Black people, which he described in the previous chapter as saying it would have been a revolutionary change. It would have transformed U.S. history for that distribution to have happened. But he's emphasizing here that it also would have transformed the political dynamics of poor whites by undermining the Klan, right? If poor white people also had access to land, right? If they weren't locked into this position, they would not have become necessarily the foot soldiers for the Klan that they, in the end, did. For the way that history played out, Du Bois says it was capitalist South and North. It was greed, South and North, that determined that there would be no distribution of land and resources, that a new capitalist dictatorship would have to be imposed by force. And as Du Bois describes it, this is on 674. Using a technique of mass and midnight murder, the South began widely organized aggression upon the Negroes. And as he puts it, armed guerrilla warfare killed thousands. Political riots were staged. Their causes or occasions were always obscure. Their results always certain. 10 to 100 times as many Negroes were killed as whites, right? So you've got a kind of strategy of tension, as we come to sort of describe it in the 20th century, where violence is always on the agenda, and that violence always tends in one direction, numerically and qualitatively, right? In terms of what it sets into force. And a shift begins to happen in the middle of page 674, again, recalling the different objectives of the poor white and the planter. Then differences began to arise. Instead of driving the Negroes to work, bands of poor whites began to drive them from work, right? So you have a sort of sea change where there's this active attempt to use sort of paramilitary Klan violence to displace Black labor and to claim a certain space within the economic system. Here, of course, Du Bois emphasizing, he's very early, although not the earliest, he's very early in emphasizing the question of accusations of rape as being central to the way that violence is inflicted. He quotes sources about how this is almost always a false claim, almost universally, a false claim. And he is pointing toward a dynamic that Ida B. Wells also had emphasized, which is very crucial, which is the way that, lynching in general but specifically the accusation of rape is used to discipline not only black men, but also white women. It's part of a compact that is offered in the form of this false safety for white women that says you have to take the safety provided by the system and by the patriarchy, otherwise we will subject you to and make you, expose you to the kind of sexual violence that, in this racialized view, black men in particular represented. And I really want to, I didn't advance the slides, emphasize a really important passage on page 678 that I want to be able to sort of dig into and think hard about, because we were talking at the beginning and even before the stream started, we were talking a lot about the relevance of this text for today. And this is one of the places where I think it becomes incredibly clear. This passage is toward the top of page 678. Du Bois is talking about mob violence in general and white mob violence in particular, but there's a sort of general, he's making general statements about it as well. Before the wide eyes of the mob is ever the shape of fear, and he capitalizes shape of fear, right? Is ever the shape of fear. Back of the writhing, yelling, cruel-eyed demons who break, destroy, maim, and lynch and burn at the stake is a knot, large or small, of normal human beings. And these human beings at heart are desperately afraid of something. Of what? Of many things, but usually of losing their jobs, being declassed, degraded, or actually disgraced, of losing their hopes, their savings, their plans for their children, of the actual pangs of hunger, of dirt, of crime. And all of this, most ubiquitous in modern industrial society, is that fear of unemployment. And then he continues on. It's nucleus of ordinary men that continually gives the mob its initial and awful impetus. A nuclear, what he refers to as an inner nucleus of fear. This is a sort of, almost like a sort of early rendition of what people associate with Hannah Arendt writing on World War II, talking about the banality of evil, the way that it's a very ordinariness and everydayness that is sort of anchors and upholds Nazi violence. But Du Bois is centering this question of a fear, and a fear that, realistic or not, is based in fundamentally economic questions. And already he had framed this earlier in the book as the fear of losing one's status, a fear of already being kind of on the edge of poverty, of knowing what it's like, and then the fear that you will fall back into it. And he asks very clearly, this is the part that's especially important for us today, right? He says, how is the mob to be met and quelled? If it represents public opinion, even passing passionate public opinion, it cannot permanently be put down by a police which public opinion appoints and pays, right? In other words, if the hatred being reflected in the mob, which is true in this case, particularly of white America, right? If it reflects public opinion, then you can hire all the police, you can tell them, the police to sort of dismantle these paramilitary forces or to prevent the mob from coming together and doing its violence. But you know that the police are supporting it, right? You know that at least 30% of lynchings, according to some statistics, police were either allowing them or facilitating them to happen, right? Why? Because the police are drawn from exactly the same people who are doing the lynching. So he's coming up against this question, again, the way the generalized question becomes sharper is this question of who represents this public opinion and how is it that you resist this kind of mob violence if the very institutions that would fight it are drawn from the same force, right? And he says it's a very difficult passage because it's not entirely clear how he wrangles this complex question. He says there are three methods. The first, by proving to its human, honest nucleus that the fear is false, ill-grounded, unnecessary, right? You can explain away the fear. You can rationalize away the fear. You can convince these people that they have nothing to fear. Or secondly, if its fear is true or apparently or partially true, by attacking the fearful thing only openly, either by the organized police power or frank civil war. And it gets very, very confusing. He says, as did Mussolini and George Washington. Very interesting little pairing, right? Or thirdly, by secret, hidden, and underground ways, the method of the Klan. He begins by saying, why don't we take the first path, right? Why don't we explain that the fear is a false one, explain that the fear of, and he runs through this from the very beginning of the book, right? The fear of black labor displacing white labor is not a realistic fear. But he says, why not? Why can't we do this? Because this is a world that believes in war and ignorance and has no hope in our day of realizing an intelligent majority of men in peace on earth. It's a very sort of damning and pessimistic view. But to that, we could add the fact that white supremacy is specific, right? It is not subject to reasoning, right? It is built on a irrational rationality, right? In which, you can try to argue with it all you want, but it doesn't actually end up working. And so that leaves, in a certain way, the other two alternatives. But those other two alternatives are both take as their premise the fact that there's something real in the fear and something that could be confronted. And the way that he's sort of making these arguments, again, are very, very confusing, but they also have these sort of unanticipated consequences, right? If you try to establish and use the sort of public system of the government to kind of confront these, you run the risk, as he puts it, of unleashing something much worse. In 1918, in order to win the war, we had to make Germans into Huns. In order to win, the South had to make Negroes into thieves, monsters, and idiots. He compares it to anti-Semitism, who have to become, as he puts it, international plotters of the protocol. And the preferred strategy in this case, and the one that ultimately plays out historically, is the secret strategy of what he calls secret underground whispering, the methods of night and mask, the psychology of vague and unknown ill, the innuendo that cannot be answered, for it is not openly published. The secret organizing is used in the South to, as he puts it, fasten dictatorship, right? To facilitate the, on the one hand, the open knowledge that there's this threat to be confronted in the form of Black Americans, freed Black Americans, but that's not spoken openly or as openly or publicly about. The dictatorship that it's fastening is a racial, what he describes as a caste system, right? Very sort of, interesting that he uses the language of caste very, very often, in part because caste has come kind of back into popularity. Isabel Wilkerson wrote a book on caste, trying to use the framing of caste to describe racism in the US. Dr. CBS, who people may know, Sharice Burton-Stelly, wrote a very, very good critique of that, arguing that there's a sort of class content to this idea that caste explains away, or not, doesn't explain away, but explains the structure of racism in the US, and specifically the economic and class structure of it. So it's worth thinking about. But what Du Bois is describing is the fact that something new is emerging in this moment. And this new system is precisely something that was not required under slavery, right? When he says back towards slavery, he, on the one hand, is describing something very real and material that's happening, but the structure of the new system that's being established has to exceed in many ways what existed under slavery. We talked about this in like week 2, when people were talking about the fact that, it's with abolition that you get a new kind of actualized and weaponized racism, right? Not that slavery was not underpinned by fundamental racism, but that the way that racism then needs to become a governing logic for all of public space is new, right? So you need new arguments about segregation, for example. Segregation didn't need to be argued in the context of slavery, right? You had new weaponization of courts, police, the emergence of police out of sort of clan type formations, the use of prisons, which we've talked about, and convict leasing as a new form to replace slavery, but in a new sort of civil frame. There was this argument under, in previous chapters that we talked about the ways in which all of a sudden you're talking about not being individual property, but being property of the state, right? State property as a replacement for individual property. So these are permutations that are incredibly important. And lynching itself was one of those, right? Lynching becomes a phenomenon after the abolition of slavery, a widespread phenomenon, and it loses that status as a phenomenon once that violence gets incorporated fully into the state with mass incarceration and capital punishment, right? So it plays a very key role in this very important transitional period. But what's important to understand is that when he says back towards slavery, he is also talking about the sort of dialectical creation and establishment of a new form of white supremacy. In this context, Du Bois strikes a tone over on, where's this passage? It's a great passage. Page 703, that in some ways you could see as contradicting the tone that he ended the last chapter with. This is toward the bottom of 703. He writes, "This the American black man knows, his fight here is a fight to the finish. Either he dies or he wins. If he wins, it will be by no subterfuge or evasion of amalgamation. He will enter modern civilization here in America as a black man on terms of perfect and unlimited equality with any white man, or he will not, or he will enter not at all. Either extermination, root or branch, or absolute equality. There can be no compromise. This is the last great battle of the West." Again, I want to sort of underline the fact that the tone and the content is very different from the end of the education chapter, which consists of kind of taking refuge in a sort of degree of passivity that allows for survival and subsistence through a period of conflict, right? And maybe the point is that this is just the ultimate frame, right? Ultimately, the struggle has to be fought. Ultimately, it has to be an open and straightforward one. The South ultimately won, over on page 706. But as Du Bois puts it, the price that is paid for this victory literally staggers humanity. Imperialism, the exploitation of colored labor throughout the world, thrives upon the approval of the United States, and the United States gives that approval because of the South. World war waits on and supports imperial aggression and international jealousy. This was too great a price to pay for anything which the South gained. The only obstacle to a better world, Du Bois writes here, this is at the bottom of 706, a clear vision of a world without inordinate individual wealth and capital, without profit and of income based on work alone, is the path out, right? The only obstacle is the determination of the white world to keep black labor poor, or to keep the black world poor and themselves rich. And across this path is just an amazing passage at the top of 707. Du Bois says, across this alternative path for human history and for the globe, the South stands with flaming sword. The revolution of 1876 was in fine a victory for which the South has every right to hang its head. After enslaving the Negro for 2.5 centuries, it turned on his emancipation to beat a beaten man, to trade in slaves, and to kill the defenseless, to break the spirit of the black man and humiliate him into hopelessness, to establish a new dictatorship of property in the South through the color line. It was a triumph of men who, in their effort to replace equality with caste and to build inordinate wealth on a foundation of abject poverty, have succeeded in killing democracy, art, and religion. Reconstruction, Du Bois concludes, it is the last paragraph, was a splendid failure. A splendid failure, a failure in many concrete ways, splendid in the vision that it offered, the material alternatives that it posed, which were not understood. The unending tragedy of Reconstruction, he writes, was the failure, the impossibility of grasping its real significance. Again, hindered by the American blind spot of white supremacy, which misunderstands even labor struggle's ability, misunderstands Reconstruction even as a labor struggle, right? But which also fails to grasp its broader importance as well. And here he turns again to the Greeks when he describes it as Athanasius contra mundum, back to the wall, outnumbered 10-1, with all of the wealth and all of the opportunity and all of the world against him. And only in his hands and heart the consciousness of a great and just cause, fighting the battle of all the oppressed and despised humanity of every race and color against the massed hirelings of religion, science, education, law, and brute force. And I know we read the propaganda of history at the very beginning of our course, but it's worth returning to the very last pages from 727 to 728, where Du Bois finally actually offers his most conclusive paragraphs. And again, we've read through these. The most magnificent drama in the last 10,000 years, the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of dark beauty of their mother continent into this newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell. And in the 3rd century, they arose from the dead. And I bring us back in part because he says once again, it was a tragedy that beggared the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation, yet we are the blind leading the blind. There are maybe 2 pieces I kind of want to end with. I mean, this is the sort of conclusion that Du Bois offers us. It's a conclusion which, as we know by this point, is grounded in both the great possibility posed by Reconstruction, the alternative world, a universal world of egalitarian abolition democracy, which brings into being labor democracy, which is intimately connected with economic questions, which was destroyed, which was beaten back, which was betrayed by poor whites, during and after which it's only poor Black people that, for Du Bois, carry within them democracy, carry within them, as we've seen in this session, a desire for education, an understanding of what education would mean, right? It's about poor Black people in the history of the US as a reservoir of radical democratic sentiments, radical egalitarian sentiment, and again, the vision for a new and reconstructed world. And as a result of that, you have this amazing and tremendous sort of inverted kind of pyramid structure, right? Where the entirety of the global capitalist system and imperialism up into the 20th century and into our present rests on what ultimately seems to be a very small group of people understood globally, in a very small territory geographically, and a very small moment of potential in human history. And that's the really astonishing thing I think that Du Bois is trying to offer us. Again, he's writing in the 30s, a period of full-blown capitalist crisis and US imperialism, and he's trying to say this foundation was laid in the 1870s. That's where we can look to see the sort of anchor points of all of what we have seen since and the structure that we need to bring down. Right? And I just want to add and bring into conversation a couple of quick pieces. One is something that has come up repeatedly throughout this seminar, which is the question of how Du Bois relates to this broader question of settler colonialism in the US context and indigenous struggles in particular. Now, of course, he doesn't talk a great deal about indigenous struggles concretely. We've seen the very interesting ways, though, that he grounds the entire American assumption in the idea of opportunity for poor people in the U.S. being, being a potent one, he grounds that in settler colonialism. So in a way, he's really very clear about that. It's the access to land that creates a kind of settler logic that permeates American society, that sort of contaminates political movements, that contaminates Black leadership under Reconstruction, because everyone is, in a certain sense, a capitalist, right? That is a huge part of what he's trying to say, and it's based and grounded in settler colonialism. But I did want to mention, because I'd mentioned before, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who's a great sort of radical historian of indigenous history and struggles. She wrote a great piece that isn't published yet. It's going to be in this book that we're putting together called The Other War Against Reconstruction. And there she's drawing this very dynamic history out about the ways in which, and we know Lincoln, as many of you probably know, that Lincoln presided over mass executions of indigenous people, right? The opening of the so-called opening and the taming of the West was part of, in some ways, part of the project of Reconstruction in ways that are sort of both understandable and also incredibly contradictory, right? The ways that, for example, the incorporation of the sort of, what's referred to as the kind of allotment period, which means providing individual allotments to indigenous people, running right up through what would, sort of concretize that in the Dawes Act, was about incorporating indigenous people as liberal individuals, right? By giving them land, but the giving of land meant the destruction of community, right? And this is a quote from an 1885 letter or statement. Treat Indians as families and individuals, extend the law over them as individuals, give them land as individuals, punish them as individuals, right? It's this sort of poison pill of sort of liberal individualism that is being presented as a gift, right? And the demand for individual land, of course, in Reconstruction is understood as incredibly important, but the way in which it is built on the dispossession of communities is a crucial part of it. And what Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz shows very interestingly is the ways in which the very same regiments that were supposed to be guarding the Black vote in the South were also being called out to attack and destroy indigenous communities in the West, right? So she makes an argument that actually the defeat of Reconstruction in the South has everything to do with the desire also to simultaneously, tame and take over the West. And that then as Reconstruction fails in the 1870s, the incorporation of the West becomes all the more important. So all of those regiments go up there. So that's a sort of really interesting piece, and please look into Roxanne's other work. She's a great comrade and a great sort of revolutionary scholar. And then also just in general, there's too much to say here. We've run over a little bit, but we, of course, take this book and this history very seriously at Abolition School. It shapes our understanding of the world. It shapes our understanding of the kind of education that's necessary for our, specific moment. That's why we call ourselves the Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction, because we understand that Reconstruction is the necessary complementing component that must accompany any abolition. And we understand that today we're living through the consequences of an unfinished Reconstruction, right? We're living out the sort of ashes and the wreckage of the destruction of that. And moreover, what we see Du Bois marking out so clearly from the beginning, which is the transformation that Reconstruction represented, which has then been fought tooth and nail by the far right, which has insisted instead on substituting a chain of deadly institutions, all of which do in different ways the kind of work that slavery had done previously, right? And this runs from Black codes and convict leasing to Jim Crow to policing to mass incarceration, right? And it's both daunting and astonishing to see the ways that this is sort of a permanent kind of repetition, but what Du Bois would understand to be a kind of dialectical progression where it matters what has happened over the last 150 years, but we also find ourselves constantly frustrated by the fact that every time there's a Black freedom struggle, every time there's an advance in any kind of rights for oppressed people in this country, you find a sort of reaction immediately from the structures of power, right? New institutions, new forms of segregation, new forms of informal segregation to replace the old. And so in a certain way, it's doing what Du Bois is already doing in the book is the task that falls to us, right? Which is to identify and understand where those continuities exist and identify and understand what leverage we have to transform them today. So in the absence of more time, that's all I will say. But I do want to turn to some questions that you all may have or questions that may be on the stream. As I've mentioned already, before we get into these questions, get excited for Black Jacobins in the fall. We're going to be studying Black Jacobins in a hybrid form. It's looking like right now we'll do that in cooperation with Haymarket Books, and so that's a very exciting sort of little project that we'll be looking forward to launching. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But what reflections do folks have? What questions? What thoughts do you find raised by this sort of, even the breadth of this text, not just the.
I have a question from the chat from David. Do you think that he is attributing the New England college systems being brought to the South as engendering like a respectability politics among Black people in the South through Jim Crow?
Whether the question is whether Du Bois sees the schools being brought to the South as engendering the respectability politics that would then emerge later?
Yes.
He doesn't say it that way at all, right? And so that's, I think, one of the questions that we can have is whether we think that might be built into his frame, but he definitely doesn't believe that, right? He sees it as a crucial element of building, not only building Reconstruction, right? Developing the transitional understanding that education is necessary for in the dictatorship of Reconstruction, and also providing a nucleus that then survives, right? So he definitely doesn't think that. What else?
I feel like this is the question I ask every time, but I was really struck going back to the education chapter, from the block quotes from folks in South Carolina about the willingness of like white working class people to send their kids to not classroom integrated schools, but schools where Black and white kids are learning in separate classrooms but in the same building, and contrasting that with or just thinking about the sort of the role that South Carolina plays in the narrative versus other states, and thinking about the sort of Black Marxist intervention that he's making, Du Bois is making in the 1930s, sliding kind of between a sort of like black belt thesis of like sort of Black nationalist independence, internal colony, versus this like Popular Front sort of like totally integrated class only theory of change. And I'm just wondering if you can sort of speak a bit more to that. And I'm trying to give you some more space to talk about Reconstruction today.
No, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, this is, so for Du Bois, like, this is definitely a moment where he's thinking more in terms of what that integration would look like, right? And whether or not working class unity can provide both the political basis for the struggle to make it possible and the content, right? The universalizing content of that. This is a fraught, and complex, conversation, right? He, even in the 30s, but certainly much later, is dealing with arguments that are more about, the Black Belt. I mean, the Communist Party position at this moment, or slightly before at the very least, is anchored in an understanding of the Black Belt that, for people that maybe don't nerd out on this shit as much, said this is a national struggle that's built on the basis of Lenin's arguments about nationalism elsewhere, which is to say this is these majority black areas of the US South should constitute a Black nation, right? And Du Bois, as I think you're right in saying, moves in certain ways closer to that, by the end of his life, and embraces that vision, I think, more fully. But there's also important tensions that it brings up. And I often refer people to, if people know Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson, have a great book called As Black as Resistance, and they're not the first to do this, but they raise these questions about how the Black Belt thesis engages with the question of indigeneity, right? But what's good about this book is that they don't make these two opposing sort of approaches, but they think about the ways in which territoriality can be rethought, right? In ways, or the way you could think through something like a black belt without, understanding it to be premised on the expulsion of indigenous people, right? Which, again, going all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion, which is this very early important founding moment for the racial binary in the US, because it posed unified black, white, working class resistance against the planters. A huge component of that resistance was the demand for more land, right? The demand to be able to actively displace indigenous people, and seize that land, right? So it's important to keep these pieces in conversation with each other, for sure. What else we got?
Is in Belated Travelers by Ali Badad. He talks about how Orientalism is mobile. It takes in its critics and criticisms and constantly tries to address its contradictions, allowing that is how Orientalism is able to exist today as an ideology. Does Du Bois look at this mobility of the racism of the South, and how can we address a constantly shifting ideology?
Mm-hmm. He definitely does, and it's a good question, though, right? So on the one hand, when you say the mobility of racism, Du Bois, like C.L.R. James, are, particularly important because they understand racism, white supremacy to be a mobile structure, right? It is not a uniform structure throughout history. We emphasize that a lot in this seminar. It is not eternal. It didn't always exist. It came into being. It came into being for specific reasons. It was sort of developed with certain interests in mind, and it recedes and it sort of ebbs and flows in different ways depending on the sort of dynamic of the conjuncture that that we find ourselves in. So that's one piece, right? And it's important to kind of emphasize. And Du Bois points toward the ways and the moments in which, of course, during Reconstruction, because of the struggle undertaken by Black soldiers in particular, and Black people more generally, the tide was turned in terms of how people even understood the humanity of Black Americans, right? So that's a crucial element in that mobility. But the question seems to be more about the question of how racism shifts and shape shifts to maintain itself, right? And here it's not so much that Du Bois foresees everything that we're going through, which he definitely doesn't. In many ways, things that he might have been guilty of earlier in his life around certain kind of elitisms or the special nature of certain sectors of the educated Black elite, might be something that's then being redeveloped today. But what he does show, I think, are the material parameters for understanding, and in effect, keeping your kind of eyes on the prize in terms of thinking about how to prevent these dynamics from rearing their head. What do I mean by that? Again, land, light, and leading. It's not just about political power. It's not just about economic power. It's not just about education, but all of these pieces are incredibly important. And if you were to look, for example, at the stretch of the 20th century through that lens, you can see very clearly, right, the Black bourgeoisie, right, like analysis, right? The analysis of the various ways that starting very early on, you had the fragmentation of what was previously a kind of compressed and uniformly oppressed Black community, a fragmentation into sort of economic elites, into political elites, which are then kind of stripped away, separated, moved to different neighborhoods, kept out of contact with the majority of people who remained very poor. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's first book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, is a really great account of this sort of temptation, of the way the fragmentation kind of emerges. And so I think Du Bois does provide us with the parameters that you could use and the lenses for diagnosing that, right? So I think in that sense, absolutely. Again, he doesn't foresee everything when it comes to the sort of politics of representation that, that we confront today. But, yeah.
Thanks. This isn't quite a question, but maybe a thought that other people are also struggling with. I think I don't know. I think I'm still kind of grappling with the way that he talks about like the South as a whole in Back Towards Slavery, and also kind of concluding, because I know that like saying like the South is like also just a rhetorical device so that he doesn't have to keep repeating like, you know, the specific groups of individuals that are perpetuating this system. But I also feel like when he says the South, like it is all encompassing of like the people and systems that exist there, and he's not just trying to talk about like white plantation owners, but like all of it, and how everyone's I don't know, complicity and education and things lead into one another. And then, you know, when he says across this path stands the South with a flaming sword, or these, you know, sweeping statements about the broad culture of the South standing in a way of progress and education. I don't know. I feel like that thinking about Reconstruction today really does mirror a lot of conversations that I still have is with, you know, a lot of folks across a political spectrum in different community spaces, but also like even on the left, about viewing the South as like a you know, a monolithic block, and you know, instead of diving into those organizing communities that do exist and have you know persevered since the time that this was written and the time period that it writes about. So I don't know. I'm very curious about how, you know, he does dedicate a lot of
How to
time
read him in this context.
to diving into those sorry, this went very long, to diving into those communities and just walking us through different pockets of progress and organizing, but then ending with a large blanket kind of wall of the South. That was very interesting.
It's a great question, and I think there's, and we've already seen, like, there's ways that the oversimplification or just the strategic simplification, right? Because you have to speak in composite terms sometimes, right? He's writing a chapter called The Planter. He can't include everything in that, right? And as we've seen, like that sort of image of the planter really disintegrates when you look at the deep, deep South. It just doesn't hold up. It's very, and if anything, it's very different, right? It's very sort of distinct as a social formation. So on the one hand, there's just the simplification that is required to do the analysis. But here, I think what's important is that I think he agrees with you 100%, right? And to be super clear, like, the South is kept in subjection because of how important it is, because of how central it is, because of how much potential struggle exists there, right? And that's right up to the present, right? And that's incredibly important to understand. That's what Du Bois, I think, is pointing towards. So when he says, across that path, the South stands with flaming sword, right? What does he mean? He means the power structure, which is what he calls at the very beginning, the 7%, although that sort of ratio shifts after Reconstruction. But what he initially called the 7%, who concentrate power in their hand by disenfranchising poor whites, by disenfranchising poor black people, right? That's what he means by the South, right? He also then refers to it as the solid South, which is the right-wing democratic South. And that's a specific political formation, right? And so I think I think he, again, on that piece, he agrees with you 100%, and he's specifically referring to the power structure and the fact that that power structure is one that has to use fascism to contain the restlessness sort of beneath the surface. And I think that's true, right? I think in the present, the South is the key to organizing. I was in a political organizing. This has come up a few times because I started reading this book as part of the kind of mandatory study in a political organization that I was in, that we inherited from an older organization that, you know, was among the first, the Sojourner Truth organization, to really center this reading of Reconstruction in their analysis of class struggle, right? And in that organization that I was in, one of the strategic decisions we came to about now, maybe 15 years ago or 18 years ago, was to send cadre to the South, right? Was to deploy people to Atlanta, to New Orleans, and make sure that we were plugged into sort of organizing struggles that were emerging in the South. And that led to very interesting discoveries, right? Which is that organizing in the South looks very different, that it often looks very slow. It looks very, it can often look very passive. It can look very reformist, but many of these things are kind of surface level. And to sort of understand the deeper antagonisms, you have to look at the fact that while the church is very important in the South, so is the long history of, like, the Deacons of Defense and Armed Self-Defense and Robert F. Williams, and, you know, struggles for sort of life and limb that gave rise to that, right? So this fraught, I think, tense contradiction is not something that Du Bois is trying to sort of minimize, if that makes sense. Yeah. I think there was another question in the room if we don't have one.
Less a question, but sort of a response to the prior question from the chat around the mobility of sort of racism, whether it be anti-blackness or Orientalism. I think like we talked, maybe it was the first week we met. Like, is Du Bois a poet, a prophet, a professor, like whatever, so many things. But to me, he's also a psychologist because he really reads into the way that society forms opinions. So when he talks about the banality of evil, it's really about individual fear. And he brings up, their fears around their job, safety, their family, etc. And then the rationalization using race is actually much more a device than the architecture of that fear. And so I think that kind of myth making is extremely mobile, and it can be mobilized and utilized in any instance because it's based on myth and propaganda. So I just thought it was really interesting how he again deconstructs that and then showcases it, and then even the ordering of the chapters is of course very intentional.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think I don't have much to say to add to that. That's really, I think, beautifully put. But it's important to understand that, I mean, again, broadly speaking, psychology as a phenomenon emerges, and specifically what's often referred to as mass psychology emerges in the late 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, prior to like the emergence of something like psychoanalysis. And why does it emerge? Because capitalism is creating huge numbers of poor people, right? Capitalism is creating mobs, right? It's creating rebellious groups of people that then need to be understood. So not only the question of psychology as an individual thing, right? But when Du Bois is talking here about mobs, right? He's saying something that is that is sort of simultaneous with the mainstream turn to like Gustave Le Bon writing about the masses and the mobs, right? And the crowd psychology, right? Why is it that people come together, they become irrational, they do irrational things? More often than not, that's done in a kind of like abstract, race-blind way, right? And he's talking about something far more specific, right? Something that has a different relationship to rationality, right? Again, when the mobs of the late 1800s are decried as irrational because they're like looting, right? Or like stealing shit, right? Like obviously that's being done from a class perspective that doesn't understand why these poor people are suddenly sort of so unruly, right? But Du Bois is definitely doing something that intervenes in that. And it's important to maybe think about the fact that people may know Du Bois invented sociology before it was a thing, right? He's getting more recognition for this now than he used to, right? As being a founder of sociology as a discipline. But to think about his contributions to psychology and think about the fact that there are ways that he doesn't go so far as psychoanalysis. And maybe there's things that, because it's in the 30s, that he could have incorporated having to do with how psychoanalysis, a Fanonian psychoanalysis that takes a few decades to then develop in an anti-colonial and anti-racist context could have also contributed.
Because this was written during a time when classical liberalism and capitalism were largely discredited, do you think both will have to be discredited beyond recovery for another Reconstruction?
That's a great question. So the question for folks that didn't hear it is Du Bois writing this in the crisis of liberalism and the crisis of capitalism, right? So that's important, right? And if we remember at the beginning, he makes this very optimistic statement. He says the American assumption, in other words, this kind of bootstraps theory, it was nearly true in the middle 19th century and then retained importance before it died in the Great Depression. And you look back on that and you're like, shit, like I wish it died, right? But it didn't, right? Because this settler logic is so deep that people, of course, we were all taught that we could, through hard work, advance ourselves, become whatever we want, that education was a path to that, even though we know more often than not it isn't. And so he is writing in a specific context, right? And so then the question is interesting because it's like, he's writing in a different context from when that possibility emerged, right? And so both of those periods are periods of extreme conflict, right? Extreme rupture. And of course, that's what it takes, right? At the same time, I think it's important to understand that we do live in a context of extreme rupture and conflict. It wasn't long ago that a president was elected named Barack Obama, running on a platform of hope and change. And people with a straight face thought that race was done, that racism was over, that we had over, and it was just like, it's crazy to look back on, right? But it allows us then to understand that we have, in certain ways, progressed from that moment, right? Because the brutal realization that those things are still very, very much below the surface has been made clear, right? And so in many ways, you know, I often categorize that as like a false universalism, right? And from the false universal, the tensions erupt, and we find ourselves now in a moment of open contradiction, open clash, open frontal war between sort of dialectical oppositions, to understand it in a certain kind of way. And in certain ways, that's better, right? Because it's the only way to get past what it is that we're confronting. It's the inevitable, you know, progression, and it's an incredibly fraught and dangerous and, you know, complicated moment that we confront. But it's a moment that, again, and we always try to emphasize this is at Abolition School, that there's no radical change without incredible peril, right? And it's tempting and it's important to be devastated by things that are happening today, even things that are happening this week and over the past couple of months. But at the same time, it's really important to understand that that's like, you know, in the old Maoist phrase, right? That great chaos under heaven is also an excellent situation in certain senses, because it means that there's opportunity on the left as well. That's the work that needs to be done, right? Is to take that crisis, a hegemonic crisis in which the old explanations don't describe the reality of the world anymore, in which young people don't believe those explanations anymore, right? To take that crisis and to move it into something different through organizing, education, and mobilization. Cool. One last question. Okay.
And that is, how do we sign up for Black Jacobins?
How do we sign up for Black? And I'm so excited about this, y'all. For those who have been watching or listening or in person with us, it's very hard for me to talk about Black Reconstruction without talking about Black Jacobins, written by C.L.R. James at almost exactly the same time, published in 1938. This was published in 1935. They didn't know that they were writing the books at the same time. James is looking at the Haitian Revolution, so something that's prior to what Du Bois is talking about, but the two are so enmeshed with each other, and both thinkers, they don't do the identical work in analyzing these historical moments, but the parallels are so striking. Even the way they name the chapters looks as if they've run almost directly in parallel. And James even writes this later essay called How I Wrote the Black Jacobins, and it includes a section on Black Reconstruction, where he's thinking about, actually arguing that Du Bois does better in terms of grasping certain kind of dynamics than he did. And I think there's a whole lot to unpack there. So I'm super excited to do that with you all in the fall. Again, our goal is for that to be organized through and in conjunction with Haymarket. I think Haymarket will be managing a kind of registration process. So please look out for it when we get toward August, and September. And again, our goal is for that to also be hybrid in this space and to be streamed via Haymarket's channels. So super excited to have you all in that as well. And if you missed these sessions, they're on YouTube, mostly with some missing sort of pieces like today. And they're being processed right now to be on Spotify as well. We're up to like episode 6 on Spotify. So you can always catch up on those as well. So thank you all so much for being a part of this. It's been a pleasure to study this text with you, this incredibly important text, to dig through it with you. I have learned more in this 15th, 20th reading of the book, and you will learn more every time you read it. So I invite you to do that. Robin D.G. Kelley, great revolutionary, contemporary sort of communist historian, and great friend and comrade of the school, says he reads this book every year. And maybe that's not true, but it's definitely an aspiration that we should all uphold. So I look forward to continuing to study with you all in the future. Thank you.